excited to speak with you about a recent project my co-authors and I completed recently, which used large language models to explore people's thoughts and feelings about death. So our question for this project was quite simple. What do people think and feel about death? Simple though it may be, I would argue that how we relate to our mortality is a cornerstone of our lives. Perhaps due to its universality, inevitability, and gravity, death has been a popular topic of contemplation for many great thinkers across history, including Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who meditated frequently on his own mortality, William James, often called the father of American psychology, who characterized death as the worm at the core of human experience, and more recently, the subject of death and its discontents has even been pondered by one of the preeminent intellectuals of our time, Barbie, who insightfully asked who among her friends thought about dying in the midst of a dance party. Jokes aside, to summarize, I think it's important that we study death concepts because death-related concerns are universal and that everyone will die and experience grief, perennial and that these concerns are at least as old as the human species itself, and pervasive, and that the knowledge of our death shapes both how we live our lives and likely whether we feel like life is worth living, perhaps especially in times of great suffering. And this connects directly to my next point. Perhaps one of the most devastating consequences of the awareness of our mortality is suicide. Humans are unique among other animals in that we sometimes intentionally seek death, and this is only possible because of our sophisticated conceptions of what it means to not be alive. The toll of this consequence is enormous. As many of us know, suicide is the leading cause of death globally. 1 in every 100 deaths is a death by suicide, accounting for more deaths per year than war and homicide combined. And the suicide rate has remained relatively stagnant over the past 100 years, unlike the rates of other leading causes of death. This suggests that we're missing some important piece of the puzzle, that is suicide, and I wonder if one of those pieces is death concepts. This is actually quite well aligned with existing theories of suicide, which often characterize suicide as an escape from aversive internal states or external circumstances. Knowing this as someone philosophically interested in death, I was fascinated to learn that so little work explored the other side of the equation, whether suicide is also shaped by what people believe they're escaping to, which of course itself would be shaped by people's thoughts and feelings about death. In other words, I wonder whether people's death concepts are salient during suicidal crises, and whether these mental representations of death differentially confer risk. To begin exploring these questions, it would be useful to first establish a descriptive foundation of the kinds of thoughts and feelings people have about death. And while there's been very little psychological work investigating this explicitly, there's actually an entire subfield of psychologists who have been asking these exact questions for decades, the terror management theorists. At least since the late 80s, they've been asking people both what emotions they experience when thinking about death and what they think will happen to them when they die. But critically, these responses have only ever been used to induce mortality salience in experimental tasks and never as data themselves. So naturally, given my interest, I was quite excited to learn this, and I was fortunate to connect with a group of such terror management theorists who were willing to share this data with me for qualitative analysis, which is precisely what we did in this project, aided by large language models. We very simply wanted to characterize what people think about when they think about death, how they seemed to feel about this, and whether these thoughts and feelings seemed to correspond with broader mental health experiences. While this was an archival data set, so we didn't have measures of suicidal thoughts and behaviors directly, we did have some self-report scores for experiences broadly related to mental health, like post-traumatic stress and meaning in life. So we went ahead and analyzed what data we did have just to see if we could pick up any signal here at all as an initial exploration. Our data set consisted of responses from nearly 2,000 participants collected across samples by Dr. Ken Vail and colleagues over the past 15 years. And the open responses we analyzed were precisely the mortality salience inductions that I showed just a moment ago. To analyze these responses, we used a multi-stage topic modeling pipeline adapted from a method originally developed by my co-author, Behbehani. And I'm very happy to explain each step in greater detail in the Q&A if there are questions, but for the sake of time, I'll just give a brief overview of our approach. So topic modeling is a natural language processing technique that clusters like text in a textual dataset to create distinct topics. The goal here is to cluster related documents, or in our case, sentences, in our corpus, that is the total body of text we're analyzing. Sentences that are grouped together are what we call our topics and represent distinct ideas in our corpus. To do this, the model uses neural networks to generate embeddings, which are dense numerical vectors represented in high-dimensional space. Basically, we're converting sentences to numbers. These decisions are possible because the model was previously trained on an enormous amount of text data where it learned to represent semantic relationships as representations in geometric space. We then apply dimensionality reduction and hierarchical density-based clustering, which basically do some math to determine which sentences belong in which cluster. And voila, we then have our topics. Once we have our final list of topics, we can simply ask an LLM to read all these documents and generate a human-readable label for that topic. And then we can apply sentiment analysis in each topic to assess whether that topic is generally expressing a positive, neutral, or negative emotional valence. Finally, we began visually exploring the relationships between the topics themselves and the relevant quantitative measures. Okay, but what did we find? Okay, so I'll start by simply showing what topics emerged from each response. As a note, I'm actually going to present these out of order just because I feel like it flows better this way. But to begin, let's look at the results for the second open response question. Jot down as specifically as you can what you think happens to you as you physically die and once you're physically dead. With this approach, we derived 22 topics, and I know this is a lot of information, but don't worry, I'm going to zoom in a bit on just the top 10 most common topics. We can see here that the most common topics were those expressing uncertainty about whether there's an afterlife, belief in the judgment of the soul, and reflections on the body's physical processes during and after death. People also discuss death as being the cessation of all consciousness and existence, and likening death to sleep. Zooming in even further, we can see some example sentences from one topic in the uncertainty about afterlife topic. People said things like, "That's the big unknown," "I have no idea," and "no one can really know." Moving on to the other open response, we examined what topics emerged when people reflected on the emotions that they experienced when contemplating their mortality. Here we derived 25 topics, with the most common topics including fear, emotional neutrality, peaceful acceptance, and sadness. And zooming in again, some example sentences from one of the most common topics, peaceful acceptance, include feeling calm and reflecting on death as being a natural part of life. But we were also curious to see how topics seem to correspond with one another. So, what kinds of feelings typically corresponded what kinds of thoughts about death? So we simply plotted instances here when one participant expressed a given topic from the feelings question and another topic from the beliefs question. So let's just take the top arm here as an example. This represents when a given participant expressed comforting Christian afterlife beliefs in response to the feelings question, and also expressed ideas about there being a judgment of the soul during the afterlife in response to the thoughts question. There were over 500 such connections when we plotted out these instances, so for the sake of interpretability, what we're plotting here is only those connections with at least 50 instances. And I think one of the most interesting takeaways from this plot is that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity, suggesting that death concepts really might be highly person-specific. But you might have noticed that even in the topics derived from the feelings responses, people wrote quite a bit about their thoughts about death, rather than only writing about the emotions they experienced. So we applied sentiment analysis to further characterize how people seem to be feeling about the topics they expressed. We can see here that there are notable differences in sentiment between topics, and in some cases, even within topics. So, the red lines represent the proportion of sentiments within each documents within each topic that were labeled as negative, green is positive, gray is neutral. So you can see, there's a lot of variability here. So just as one example, zooming in a bit, we can see that feelings related to existential reflections were quite diverse in sentiment, and this is clearly reflected when we examine the documents within this topic, in which people are both saying things like, life is hard, but also reflecting on the preciousness of every moment. Okay, and finally, we explored whether topic expressions seem to correspond with differences in mental health experiences. First, PTSD. We see here that PTSD experiences do seem to differ across topics, but notably sample sizes vary considerably, so more data are needed to fully confirm these relationships. Zooming in a bit, we can see that people who express thoughts and feelings related to afterlife beliefs had relatively lower PTSD scores, while people who envisioned death as darkness and relief from suffering reported relatively higher PTSD scores. And I thought this was really interesting because it really maps onto clinical intuitions. We also saw differences in meaning in life scores, with thoughts and feelings related to fears and reflections on non-existence and nothingness corresponding with relatively lower meaning in life, and existential reflections and afterlife beliefs corresponding with relatively higher meaning in life, which again, I think maps onto intuitions. Okay, but I know that's a lot of information, so what can we take away from all of this? First, people report a wide variety of thoughts and feelings about death. Thoughts often orbit physical processes and spiritual and religious reflections, while feelings range from fear and uncertainty-related anxieties to peacefulness. Notably, sentiment varies quite a bit within topics, suggesting that even when two people have the same thoughts about death, these can elicit very different feelings in different people. Second, thoughts and feelings about death do seem to map onto at least some mental health experiences. We could see before that the average PTSD scores and meaning in life scores did differ among people who expressed some different topics, though again, more data are needed to fully confirm these relationships. And I also want to just take a moment to address what I imagine will be a question already at the end, which is, are these findings simply explained by religious identity? And the answer is, it doesn't seem to be the case. We can see here that death concepts vary notably, even among people of the same religious identities, which I think is quite interesting. But let us not forget that this is indeed a suicide talk, so what are the implications of these findings for suicide research? I think the most important implication here is that people with different death concepts do appear to endorse different mental health experiences. So I think it's justified for future work to explore whether this is also the case for suicide. Given that, as I said earlier, we're really struggling in suicide research to forecast who is at risk for suicide, especially within short timeframes, I think that beginning to ask people about their death concepts may provide one more important piece to the puzzle that is the complex dynamical system of suicide. And importantly, I think this also may pose a useful clinical target. If we know what people desire from death, then we may be able to help them cultivate it in life, thus rebalancing the relative attractiveness of dying versus staying alive. But because death concepts are highly heterogeneous, like I said, we need more data about what thoughts about death are likely to elicit what feelings, in whom, and when these may forecast or even confer risk. In other words, we need to know not only what death concepts people have, but which are most salient and influential during times of distress. And gaining this knowledge is precisely what we plan to do next in our lab's large-scale ecological momentary assessment study. In this study, which investigates suicidal thoughts and behaviors in people's daily lives, we will also begin asking people about their thoughts about death multiple times a day. This work will represent the first direct test of the impact of people's daily thoughts about death, rather than thoughts about suicide alone, on suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So just to summarize all of this, we know that many suicidal people view death as an escape, and we routinely ask them what they are seeking escape from. But I hope today I've convinced you that the opposite side of the equation is important as well, and that suicide researchers should also seek to consider what people escape to. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions after the rest of our wonderful speakers.